Okay, thank you everyone. Good afternoon. My name is David from Skyscanner. What I'll warn you before this starts, just in case anybody wants to be sure, this isn't a particularly technical talk. It's more about product choices and the sort of things that contribute to app performance away from pure technical metrics. There is a technical section later on because I felt I had to put something in there just to please the developers in the room, being a former developer at one point myself. So there is a little bit of technical in it, but if anybody isn't keen on a non-technical talk, I thought I'd better warn you up front, and we won't be offended at all if you want to leave and go and see something else just now. But just to warn you up front before we start. I chose this topic deliberately and left the subject a little bit vague because I like to keep people guessing before I stand up and talk. So the art of mobile performance, it's really about the different things you have to think about in owning an app product. So where I work with Skyscanner, I'm the developer advocate. It's my job to look after things like how our mobile apps can be turned into other things by other people. So we're keen for other people to take our mobile components, data, SDKs and things like that and turn them into better products with our advice, and we're more than happy if somebody takes flight search, which is our core business, and actually makes a really good app out of flight search using pieces of our stuff, and we're more than willing to help them do that as long as it's going to add some value, and that's the kind of thing we're going to talk about through this talk today. Just to give some background on Skyscanner before I start, not too much though. We have apps in the stores and also a long-standing desktop website. We're about 13 years old. The apps have, the official number we give is 35 million app downloads, is the last press release we did. I think the unofficial number is about 41 million now. So we have a lot to protect out there, and in terms of performance, the sort of scale we reach gives us different challenges than we had the day we launched it. And again, that's something I'll come back to later. And there's a lot of people entering the market against us, and possibly foolishly. And again, we'll talk about a few things our competitors do that aren't right. Just for some background on the sort of mobile angle at Skyscanner, is something I looked after for the last 2 years or so. Skyscanner asserted itself to being a mobile-first company from having a desktop site for about 12 years at that point. What we saw was a massive rise in traffic on mobile devices. I think it runs at about 77% increase every year on mobile alone. And that's something that's actually continuing and getting bigger all the time. So even though we're still growing across desktop as well, there's new users coming all the time, we still attract about 77-80% new users every year on mobile. So we completely changed the company to think about mobile first, and that's really what I'm trying to get to you today, the sort of principles of mobile, the things you have to think about, and make sure you're doing the right things to make your product work, and that's really what performance is all about. The thing you see on the screen there is a snapshot of our internal networks, so just to try and get people thinking about mobile a bit differently, we ask people to use simulated networks at different times of day. So, for example, if they're developing something specific to mobile, an enhancement or something like that, we ask them to test it in a simulated 2G network first, because one of our major markets in India has most of its growth in mobile from 2G connections that are really slow and laggy, so we ask them to test it in that environment, then go up to 3G after that, and just make sure they start at the lowest possible experience and make it better. So we try and embed that in the company day to day. What we also do is ask people to use devices that users would. So we have something like 300 devices spread around the company to make sure people experience what everybody they deliver to and build for would experience. So everything from a £20 Android phone, $20 Android phone from the Far East, or something you'd use in Africa or India, to a very high-end tablet, and we're about to try things on the new iPad with the massive screen just to see how our products behave on it. That's one of the benches we have in the office. I think we have about 6 of these now. People are just free to go and try things out, whatever job they do, and just make sure we're doing the right things. The reason I pitch this talk is because we do a lot of conferences, and last year I did a conference in London where I was on a panel, the subject being app quality. And despite the subject, and you'd think it would be about how to develop apps and the sort of things we're going to talk about today, I was the only person on the panel that had any involvement in building an app. So the other 4 people on the panel were vendors of performance monitors, so people like New Relic, Criticism, App Dynamics, Splunk, and companies like that, which contribute towards some of app performance, but they're in a very niche position. They only worry about crash rates API slowdowns and things like that. And there's so much more to the performance of an app, and even having an app in the first place than that. And I challenged the guys on stage that they were only there to sell their products, and they don't actually know very much about app quality at all, and it didn't go down that well, but it developed into a presentation I've used a few times since, and this is what you see today. So what we'll hopefully go over is a few things about whether you should have an app in the first place, how to think about mobile a bit differently, the sort of things you need to do once you've got an app out there, and the technical section on some things that make you think about performance purely in hardware, software metrics, and how that relates to whether your product actually works or not. So hopefully, because we're overrunning a little bit today, I'll try and get through this in about 45 minutes, and you can ask some questions if you wish. Start from here. So, are you doing the right thing is the first question to ask, and it's something that goes on a lot in the world at the minute. Myntra, the example on screen there, is a huge company in India. They're one of India's largest online retailers. So they had a desktop site that stood for a while. It did okay, but they had a feeling they were doing the wrong thing because most of their growth, like us at Skyscanner, came from mobile users and mobile devices. So they sat and thought about it and thought, when they looked at their product, it could be so much better built as a mobile app. And in the end, they got to the point their mobile app was good enough as a standalone product and the audience was big enough, they turned off the desktop site overnight. Now, at that point, the desktop site was still about 30% of their revenue. So you would expect that 30% of revenue to disappear overnight. What Myntra found was the mobile app was so much better. Once the desktop users migrated to it, they actually made 10% more money than they did before. Despite cutting out the 30%, they actually added 40 back again, roughly. So they've made more money overall just by getting the product right and thinking differently about how they could do mobile in the first place. This is something we had to think about at Skyscanner as well, because we had massive growth in mobile web all of a sudden that caught us out by surprise. And we had to think really differently about how our website worked, how it reacted to different devices, and we had to basically take a break and think really hard about who we were delivering products to. And the performance of the product falls out of that. It's not that we just sat and looked at numbers. We sat and thought, what is the product at the end of the day? When do people use it? And what do they use it for? And we had to go right back to square one and think about, what does mobile actually mean? And we sat and talked about this for 2-3 weeks even, just to make sure we were doing the right things in the right countries. So this is how we illustrate it. If you think about what is mobile, 3 people sitting on a metro train in London. First one's clearly on a phone, so that's the absolute definition of a mobile user. On the phone, on the move, probably a bad connection, probably public Wi-Fi. So that one's a yes, definitely. This guy's on a laptop, but he's probably using the same connection. He's definitely moving, so you can infer that he's mobile as well, in a way. He might not be using an app on that particular device, but he's certainly mobile. This guy's not showing any traits of being a mobile user. Apart from headphones, you might think he's got them plugged into a phone or an iPod with apps on it or something like that. But he's, again, on the move, and we don't know that he's not wearing a wearable. And if anybody can tell me what this Apple Watch is actually for, I might give them the prize at the end of this, because I haven't figured it out yet. They're all mobile at the end of the day, and what we're talking about is people with different needs at different times, depending on the particular thing they're looking at the time. And that's what we had to really go back and think about quite hard. Did we deliver to all of these people? At the time, we kind of thought that apps were everything we needed in mobile, and desktop was really for the HTML people. It's not. I mean, all of these guys might need something different at different times of day, and we just weren't reaching them all properly. And we had to go back and think, if you try and boil it down to whether people need web or apps, it's actually both. You can't really second guess which one they're going to use at different times of day. Native apps have their uses, mobile web has its uses. And nowadays even, it almost might not be a client. The way we're going in the Far East, people shout at things by default. They don't type. So it might be they're shouting at a phone or a watch or something else. So you're not even talking about what the front end looks like. You're just dealing with a particular user need at a different time. And that's something that gave us a lot of trouble because we just didn't deliver to it. And it's something people really need to think about before they build an app, because this talks about app performance. Do you actually need to build it in the first place? Can you meet it by giving people a voice search embedded in something like Google or Siri or one of these other platforms? Can you deal with it with mobile web? And the way Vitaly talked a few minutes ago about the different things you can do there, is that enough? Do you really need to take it to an app? And there's more things you have to think about beyond that. All the different plethora of devices you might need to hit, and the different things that you have to think about. This is Google's app wall from Google I/O, pardon me. where they have something like 200 devices, and you can plug your product into that and see them all at once and see how it behaves, which ones break, which ones crash. It gives you a way of thinking about the fragmentation of 20,000 different combinations of Android you might need to build for. And again, in some respects, it's possibly easier to do that in a web product than an app one. And you have to think about the grief you might get from launching an app. But then you look at some of the studies that have been done the last few years about usage of products. So Flurry, the app analytics business, publishes an annual report. The last one I could find is 2014. Believe the next one's quite soon. They have said consistently that app use dominates mobile use. So people on phones tend to use apps the majority of the time. Now, I would question that, and I would ask you to question it yourselves. If you are sitting with a phone in your hand, how often do you actually spend it in apps? I mean, the default one's like a mail app on iOS, fair enough. But many people sit in Facebook all day, sort of average consumer users, reading articles that are actually delivered in a web browser within Facebook. So even though they're in an app, they're actually viewing pieces of HTML. So you have to think differently about the kind of things you're serving to different people and where they view them. So I would argue that that percentage should actually be a lot lower, but that's how Flurry measure it. But think hard about how you do these things. And then from the same data, ComScore, another analytics company, actually found that the majority of growth in mobile use is actually from web browsers. And I think they've split out things like Facebook browser to make this point. So the growth year on year of usage in total volume of people is way better on web than it is on mobile. So again, come back to think, with the sort of people you need to reach in the markets you're going to speak to, is web the dominant platform that people want to use? Or is it an app the default way people want to use it? Just think differently, and that's what this talk's all about today, hopefully. Make you think differently when you go home about what you're working on and make sure you're doing the right things. And then you spread that out and all the different things we've looked at so far. It's not about devices, it's not about apps versus web platforms. It's really about context. I mean, more people wear wearables every day. That's another context we have to think about. And as I said, nobody's really answered what a wearable is for yet, so we have to still figure things like that out. But all the different contexts you answer, the person on the train with the phone might be needing something at that given point in time. The guy on the desktop might be doing research. He might pull the phone out 5 minutes later to continue it on foot. There's different things you have to deal with. It's not just about devices and the hard side of things. It's about the soft side and what people want at different times, and that's all about contexts, and they should all add up to what you do and what you build in the first place. There's a book on this that's very good, called The Mobile Mind Shift. I would recommend people try and find a copy of that. It explains all this very well. It's a case study of 200 companies around the world and how they dealt with this very problem, and they thought they were working on the wrong things and how they changed their product to cope with it. And the statement they come out with is that the mobile shift means the expectation that people can get what they want in the immediate context in the moment of need. It's all about a two-sided process that you can deliver something to somebody and figure out the exact point they want it. And really that's what apps are for. Given the sort of sensor technology of apps with location and acceleration and geography and things like that, you should be able to make this particular context model work, where web and other things probably don't. So that leans you towards having an app again. And really, if you've got a product that meets this sort of thing, then that apps are probably the way to go. But it's all about making decisions about different things. If you want to meet the absolute number of people, then you probably do need to still deliver an app and a web product to keep all the users hooked up. And we have a method at Skyscanner to do that. We call degrading to desktop, which I used this slide at the same conference last year and really confused everyone with it. So I hope I'll explain it a bit better this year. But what we mean by that is if you decide to deliver an app to people, that will always be the most complicated thing you build for. And if you think about that in terms of the methods available to speak to people on an app in terms of using the sensors in the app, as I said, geography, location, acceleration, other things you know about from the OS. And that will always be the most complicated usage pattern you have to deal with. And it will always be, presumably, the most complicated product to deliver with all these different contexts we talked about. If you then dumb that down to desktop, which might have a slightly different design, it might be a different looking product, it will never be as complicated as the app you might build for those users. So we call it degrading to desktop, and even in mobile web, we try and deliver something different and then effectively dumb it down for desktop users. And it's all about whether somebody's an active user looking for a context to be met, like we just said, or it's a passive web user who happens to dip into a website every now and again for a particular thing. Again, it's an important thing to think about. Quite complicated, but I hope the point got across this time. That's how we do it at Skyscanner. Try and start with mobile and the complicated bit and the screens you have to deal with and bring it back to desktop where it should be relatively straightforward by comparison. So decision time. But all these decisions we just talked about, different things you have to think about. Do you need to build an app at all? Have a think about that for a second. I don't know what you work on as an audience, but have a think for a second. If you have an app, does it meet the sort of things we talked about as we go forward to different devices and contexts? Should you just deliver something simple, a website, or even a very, very simple app that doesn't use some of the context we talked about for a particular audience? It's very, very hard to make choices like that. Let's say you chose to build an app, or you already have one. So we'll move on and think about how you do that the best way. What we do at Skyscanner is something we call leaning on the platform to make sure you build the app in the most efficient, reusable way that can then be opened out to other contexts as the market changes or new devices come out. And what we do is start by looking at the wider internet where you've got standards, communities, and even things like open source that give you a head start before you're going to do something, because people tend to prototype things before you actually use them. So start there and figure out before you start the engineering that you're going to be building something in a reasonable way that the rest of the market understands. Work your way down through the OS and the platform itself. So, for example, iOS, Android give you a lot for free, tested to a reasonable degree and delivered in reusable ways. Platforms and OSs do a lot of the work for you, essentially in terms of guidelines and expectations for users. If you're using an iOS app, you expect the next one you use to feel pretty much the same. And a lot of companies break that model where they try and reinvent things all the time. Users start with the OS apps because they're the things that are installed from scratch. Your app shouldn't be too far from those or it's going to break the experience moving around the phone because yours won't be the only app they use. So keep that in mind. Standard components, for example, things like CocoaPods coming further down. The part of this belongs to the open source part at the top, but this is really about the nuts and bolts of putting apps together. Standard components that are adopted by a wide population, useful, tested ways to do things. Think about that and what you can get for free again, that you don't have to keep building things yourself. Just use what's already out there and adopted. Don't reinvent all the time. And lastly, having done all that, if you do have genuine needs for things that you can't find anywhere or contexts or components that aren't met by the market, just build those distinct ones that you need for your product. The rest of it behind that should be reusable and reasonably efficient. There are examples in the market. You can look at things like the British Airways iOS app, for an example, is almost entirely built from components that come from iOS itself. They put a design over the top and skin for their own needs, and over time they've had to add a couple of extra discrete components for their own benefits, for things like checking in, for example, that has to be done a little bit differently. But by and large, I think it's about 90% of the app came for free from the OS or from well-adopted components, which makes their development so much easier. And when they get to things like iOS 9, which is a bit of a change, or Android M, they're not jumping too far. They're just replacing the system things that already came and adding what they need to. So it's a really efficient way to run an app if you're still not sure it's the thing you need to do, or if you haven't got a big development team. Keep that in mind. The Hotel Tonight's one of my favorite examples, and I get in trouble for using this. They're one of our rivals, but I get in trouble for using this because it's a really good mobile-only product in the market. They started with a business case, going back a few slides, to the contexts people are going to need a hotel and what devices they're going to book it with. So they defined that hotel users, from their research, to a large degree, I think they said it was about 50% of hotel bookers, wanted a hotel in a location that they already exist on the day they need it. So let's say they came to Krakow yesterday and hadn't booked anything for this conference yet. That is a Hotel Tonight user, somebody that needs to find somewhere pretty quickly. And Airbnb do it very well too. So they built their entire app to answer that need. So they start with a very simple interface, again, using mostly system components that they design really well, just to try and get prices in front of people who want to buy them quickly. Now, they've taken it a little bit further, and again, talking about the better things you can do with a native app in terms of the sensors and location awareness. If you're within something like 300 meters of a hotel in a location, they will actually alter the price because the fact you're near that hotel means you're more likely to book it. So by changing the product just to think about the mobile context they have to answer and the fact that somebody's in a location on a day, they've made their model different. And even though they've had to take a discount on these hotels to sell them and make it more encouraging, they have far more bookings as a result. They call it the geo price crash, I think. So again, it's all about what you can do with mobiles that they just couldn't physically do on desktop. Their entire product depends on people registering for things like notifications to be told when a price is available near to them. Just keep that in mind about how you develop, who you're developing for. Desktop site would be no use to them at all. They'd just be another booking.com who are here today, I think, so I hope I'm not getting myself in trouble saying that. But they are a different product to that. And it all went in from research at the start. Then you think about other things in different markets of the world. KakaoTalk, who are on the slide there, are the biggest app in Korea, which is a very big market for Skyscanner in particular. Like many people around the world think Facebook is the internet. In Korea, KakaoTalk is almost the internet. So many products that people use are inside KakaoTalk. It's an Android platform, so effectively you build a micro Android app that lives within their one. It's almost like building an SDK to work with these guys. Now they have means of people paying for things. They have means of replacing Google search, for example, as the default. So as long as you live within this, you'll get the benefit of the entire KakaoTalk ecosystem. And it's something to get somewhere in Korea, you have to be in there. And it's something we're working on quite hard just now. But there's different examples of these around the world. The Far East effectively exists on these kind of platforms. So things like Alibaba, WeChat, you have to be inside their product. So even though they're inside Android as an overall ecosystem, people effectively have to build small components of apps to go inside their app, which is a hard thing to get your head around because you lose a bit of control over it. But if you develop things, as I explained, in the right way and only build the bits you really need to and separate the inside of your app so that it can be reused in components, this is the way to do it, and that's where you get the reach of the global market like we have to chase. Facebook, another one. A question came up earlier on about the amount of releases that apps do and how that affects bandwidth usage, and that's a performance consideration as well, that you're affecting people's data allowance all the time, something I'll come back to later on with networking. But if you think about your product being, I think it's about a 90 meg download Facebook, every time you issue an update for that, because there's no incremental updates inside the app, it's a complete download each time. You're taking 90 meg of somebody's bandwidth away. And in India, people just couldn't physically afford that. We found in the Philippines, as a slightly different example, that it cost $36 to download our app. And if we put out, on the Spotify model, for example, a release every week or 2 weeks, think how much that's actually costing somebody in a year just to have the benefit of your app on the device. That's a performance consideration that's nothing to do with real sort of technicalities. Facebook met the challenge by delivering a completely separate app in India. Now, they used sort of components that belong to the main global app. They just removed a lot of things that weren't necessarily relevant to India, thinned down the product, and only used the absolute minimum set of components they needed, and a little bit of wiring up of hybrid web as well, just to get the experience a little bit further on. 1 meg download instead of 90, which the Indian market is now accepting, and people are downloading it. Facebook would never have got to the scale in India that they enjoy in most of the rest of the world with the same product they use in the United States, for example, in Europe, where bandwidth's a lot better. In India, they had absolutely no chance unless they did this. And again, it's all about being able to deliver thick and thin versions of your products and engineering them in such a way you can spit out a slightly different product for a slightly different market without doing a complete rebuild. If you look at how Facebook start to spin out apps like Paper and Slingshot and different Messenger spun out as well, by the way. They basically take components from the main app, turn them into a thinner app, and they're still maintaining the same set of components underneath. They're just delivering 2 or 3 apps from them. So it's a good thing to get your head around and how you deliver apps in that way. Forrester Research, I know people aren't fans of consultants and these kind of businesses, but they put together what they call the 4-tier engagement platform, which is really a way to do this at scale and try and do it efficiently. So starting at the bottom, and I don't know if I can get the light to work. No. Starting at the bottom, the data sources that you use in terms of mobile, the data you can consume from a mobile phone in terms of where people are, what they're doing, other things you can tap into, social media data, for example, data they volunteer to you by filling in registration, for example. You have data sources as an entirely separate layer, just massive buckets of data collected almost in real time. Above that, you then need a transformation layer to take that data and remove the bits you don't need for a particular context. So you say that the Hotel Tonight example, you only really need to know the person's in a location and maybe some history of the kind of hotel they've booked before. They might prefer 3 stars or that kind of thing. Boil that down to a particular data query for that particular context. Above that, the traditional application layer, which in the past would have been the only layer you deliver to, probably a desktop one, to take the optimization, caching, and sort of raw performance of what you're going to deliver. But then above that, the layer that's kind of the new thing that you need to think about is all the different clients you're going to deliver to. And nowadays, it could be anything from desktop to mobile web to apps to Internet of Things to wearables. They're all clients at the end of the day that deliver different things. Going one layer down, there's still applications delivered by something, but it's a fragmentation of different things you have to send to different people. And it's important to separate all these layers out, that from the very bottom, you're only taking the small amount of data that you need for that particular context and deliver it right through that stack to the particular context the person expects to see. We believe it's a world of possibilities, and at Skyscanner, we use this model or a variation of it to deliver lots of things to different companies. So for example, at the very bottom right, we just launched a product under MSN's branding, but it's actually us looking after the product as MSN Flights. All the things you see on the screen, apart from a couple, we're not quite into HoloLens yet, although we'd like to be. We're effectively supplying a client of some sort to each of these platforms. Google Now is a very good example. So we deliver flight price changes to users through Google Now. All we're supplying is a very tiny packet of data to Google Now, which Google then delivers to its client at the time they think the client's likely to read it. So we're giving away some of the context to Google, but Google knows when somebody's most likely to want a flight price because of the search history and things like that. We find that by being in Google Now, we actually get double the conversion of flight bookings by sending somebody a price change than if we sent it on our own. And that's actually climbing day by day as people get used to Google Now and the kind of things it does. And we try to get to these things early, but we do it by having the ability to spin out small, thin pieces of data or pieces of client to these particular contexts at different points. So you can see what you can do if you do things in the right way and how you can spread your product out to lots of different places. So having been through all that, it's probably a good idea if you have the context, the product, and the users to meet to build an app. And this is when we really start to think about what you might have thought traditionally as performance, down to numbers and things like that got me into the argument at a conference last year in the first place. You have to think about all of this before you think about any numbers or metrics at all. But one last thing, even though you've figured all this out, you've got a product you think is going to work, you've got all the contexts answered, how do you know it's not being answered by somebody else already? Just bear in mind that there are 2 million apps in the store. You might be about to release something that nobody wants in one particular example, or something that's already being done very well, or something that people just aren't searching for. And we'll come back to a few of these things in a second. I was at TechCrunch Disrupt in the States last week. Somebody actually tried to launch a face recognition app for cats. And I'm not sure the market's ready for that yet, and I'm not even sure what it was for. Nobody wants a social network for dogs, which was another one somebody tried to pitch. Nobody wants another social network, because there's plenty of those as well, but people do still try. So having gone through all this, they've made a product that meets everything we talked about. Doesn't mean that anybody's going to use it or going to find it. Which brings me to the next part of performance, which is once you've got a product out, you need people to find it and use it and like it. The first thing is really, when you're met with the App Store, which is your first contact point with the app you build to get it downloaded, whether it's on a phone or this is iTunes Desktop, do people actually understand what it's for? So our company name is Skyscanner. In other markets, that might not translate very well. It might mean astronomy, astrology. We've had people think it's about the moon and stars. If you do a search, people do actually get us mixed up with apps about space. So we adjust our pages in the app stores and really try and optimize them for specific keywords about what we do. And it seems an obvious thing, but you'd be very surprised at how many companies don't bother with this. They just put out their company name or whatever they think is right and hope people will find it. Again, with 2 million apps in the store, life's not like that. So you have to really compete the same way you do SEO on a website. So we go for Skyscanner flights, airlines, compare deals. We nudge that by testing it as much as we can. Google Play's open it up to A/B test different naming conventions and different keywords and things like that. Apple hasn't quite yet, but we do measure through the means we get from iTunes and Google Play which keywords work, which bring the most downloads, and which users actually stay with the app afterwards, which is the important thing. So having gone through all this, you want people to get the app and get what they thought they were going to find. So a lot of times in the store, you'll download an app and it just doesn't do what you expected for various reasons. The text and the title in the App Store is your first chance to do that. So bear that in mind very carefully and really dig into App Store optimization, which is something people just don't think about enough. The second way you hit people is through screenshots, and a lot of them are extremely bad. Some are quite good. But again, this is your shop window to people to make them understand what you're going to give them. InstaSize is a sort of branch from Instagram. You can see from the screenshots reasonably clearly, alongside the text that they provide, what that app is going to give you. They actually put some text explanations in amongst the screenshots. So it's not a bad way to introduce people to what you do. Other people get a bit more creative and supply screenshots in a row that give a bit more of an impression of what the app's going to do. That one's a way of sharing contacts through Bump. But again, you can see the things are bumping together. 2 separate screenshots in the store, but 2 is all it needs out of the 5 you're allowed to have. That explains itself pretty well. Then you get things like this, and unless it explained itself really well, and some people don't read the title and text, so the screenshots may be your only chance with them. Would you know from first glance what this actually does? Because that was the only screenshot for this particular app in the store. I probably wouldn't download that, even if it was something I was going to use. I'll try and find a different one that explained itself to take up the space on my phone or tablet. Or that one, which it may be of interest to some people, but it probably advertises the fact it's a crap design and therefore probably a crap app. So you probably bypass that and look for a different one. I actually have no idea what that app's for. I presume it's some sort of football ground finder in the UK, but I actually don't know. Or that one. God alone knows what this app is for. I presume it's some sort of leg waxing simulator. And again, why would anybody want one of those? But the blurb was almost non-existent. It was called Leg Spa, which the screenshots would also suggest, but I actually don't know what that app is for. So why would anybody download it? Then you work on to the next part of it, which is reviews and ratings, which is the most important part of all. Because if people get past the screenshots and text, which most people tend to bypass nowadays, especially on phones where the space is limited in the App Store apps, ratings are the shop window to see if other people actually like it. And this is something that's caught Skyscanner quite badly in the past. We do really well. We've had 250,000 ratings of our app in the last 4 years, which is a lot to live up to once it's there. And we average 4.5 across those 250,000. Out of 5 stars, that's quite an achievement, given the sort of level of downloads and things like that. But you get the odd panic, such as 2 years ago, roughly 2 years ago now, AVG, the antivirus company, decided that our app was malware, and it was a complete mistake. But in the space of a week from them doing that, we found many 5-star reviews had turned to 1 star. A lot of people turned up all of a sudden just to give us a 1-star review and say to the world, this is a virus, don't use it. We also lost 100,000 downloads in 3 days, if I remember right, just from that happening, and people saying in the App Store, it's not for you, and our traffic went down to almost nothing for that time as well, because people stopped using it. Now, a lot of companies sit back and watch the App Store and let it happen, but you can actively manage it. In that case, most of the bad reviews were on Google Play, and thankfully Google is nice enough, they let you speak to users and try and tell them it's not true. And we got AVG to put a statement out saying it was a mistake, and it got rectified, and we got whitelisted pretty quickly so it never happens again. But we were able to get our customer service team in the App Store for about 2 days, replying to every single review that came up, naming the antivirus stuff. We managed to repair, I think, about 60% of the reviews. So either people removed them and said sorry for the mistake, or they corrected it to 5 stars because we'd actually dealt with it really well and been personal and spoken to them. And that was an important thing to us to try and rebuild some of the trust in public. And that's really what it comes back to. You're doing your customer service in public through these app stores. Because these things you see, this is from App Annie, which is a really good product for sort of monitoring your app reviews and ratings. But it's public data. You can go to iTunes and see exactly what this says. You can see the average, our average 5 is pretty good, but you can still see there's that rump of red at the bottom where you've got 1-star reviews and the things we try and answer. There's one on the screen there that somebody didn't like the last release we put out, and too bad, and people swear at us and things like that. But we always try and answer these people back if we can, even if we have to try and put a release out. In iOS, you're not allowed to speak to the users. They're basically anonymous. But we can put a release out to say, thanks for the comments, Mr. Whoever, we've fixed your bug. And you do that through the what's new text or the change log. And you try and do your support in public that way. And you see a lot of apps now that deal with it that way. They have creative what's new text to say, we've listened, our last release was crap, we've put another one out. And that's becoming more common all the time, to try and confront problems that people found, especially going back to the Spotify talk and the pace of releases now. You really need to be careful what you tell people about them and how they react, because it all happens in front of your users. That's a bit of a skate through sort of product performance. And what I promised my colleagues back home to do was a trip to the dark side and actually look at some technicalities of how you measure how apps actually work underneath. We did a bit of a study on this last year, and the sort of things we should be able to measure automatically, and the sort of things you really need to think about under the bonnet. So I did promise I'd go to dark for a little while and talk technicalities. There are a number of layers that performance can be measured at. So starting with the hardware itself, and we're going to focus on battery life, because I couldn't focus on them all today in the time we've got. APIs, which you should control, unless you use something like Parse or one of these cloud services. You should be in reasonable control. UI and UX at the front. And I'll go through some examples of each one and how we look at measuring these things. But we'll come back to how these actually wire up to the overall performance of the product afterwards. All of these things have different facets. So display and transition time, request response latency on APIs, and the actual hardware practicalities. And as I said, we're going to focus on battery, because in the app stores, after things like the antivirus problem that we had briefly, battery life is one of the biggest complaints people make in public about apps. Even if you haven't actually caused it, you still get blamed for it. By the way, for us, the biggest complaint we get for our product is that the flight price the airline charges when they actually exit to them isn't what we said it was. And we don't have any control over that. We're being given 1-star reviews for the airlines not actually putting real prices into our app, which is something we have trouble with, and we try and penalise for doing it. But second biggest is probably about battery life, so it's important to have a look at that for a second. With mobile applications, it's incredibly important to be efficient. And you think about the different culprits that kill battery life on a device. The screen, the network, the GPS, storage, camera, these are all things that use use energy at different times of day. Now, of these, in our particular app, we have to focus on the ones we can control. The screen is in use because people are using our app. We can't avoid that. We don't do anything because we're not really able to. We don't leave the screen on. We don't affect the OS to change people's settings. So we can't really do much about that. The network is one we can completely control because we know what our app speaks to. Once it's on the device, it's up to us how often it speaks to our backend or other people's backends. GPS, we only use once to get a location for a user when the app starts. Then we turn it off again. So we completely control that. Otherwise, it's not necessary for us to use it after that first hit. Storage access we use very, very occasionally just to try and maintain things between sessions, but we do it as infrequently as we can. Low usage completely. And camera, we don't actually use at all. So thankfully, we haven't got too much to deal with in battery. And when users complain, we can explain this to them, that we don't really do that much that would affect it. So picking out network, that's the important one. So we can use various things. You could be on 3G, 2G, you could be on Wi-Fi, to receive data about flight prices, which is what we do. There are different things you can do to control that. So you can minimize and batch network transfers. A lot of good SDKs, Google Analytics, for example, they don't constantly make connections to the network. They hold things for maybe a minute or 30 seconds and pulse out any data they use to the back end, so it's not being done too often. And that actually saves battery time as well as bandwidth. And in our app, we had to look at non-core API requests. So over the years, we had product requests to add some third-party API, for example, an analytics product to the app. We ended up having 15 separate things effectively making analytics calls to different backends. Now, we don't control those very well because SDKs tend to be licensed to themselves, and you can't control how often they do things. They're not as good as us at sending every 30 seconds and things like that. So what we can do is completely remove them. So I think we've got that down to about 3 in the most recent release. So we can control the networking by controlling who gets to do it within our product. So these are all things that affect battery life, and it's incredibly important to think about this. But it's also a way, again, to do your customer support in public, that when people complain, we can explain that we're doing things in a very good way and prove it. And we've had to do that with 1 or 2 users to explain to them, we're not killing your battery. Please come and use our app. And it leads us on to API performance, which, if it's speaking to our API, not one of the SDKs we just talked about, is something we can completely control. So that in essence, the core of it is API requests need to be fast, efficient, and necessary to minimize bandwidth, battery life, and things like that. They have to be fast, efficient, and necessary. I'm going to repeat that over and over again. And there's details on the screen about what that gives us. You really minimize the request and response time, which, as long as you control your own back end, shouldn't be that difficult to do. Remove the payload that you give down to the app, so it's only getting the piece of data, going back to that 4-tier architecture we talked about. You're only bringing data to the app that it actually needs at that particular time and not stuff it throws away, because that's a complete waste. That increases efficiency overall. And only do it if it's absolutely necessary. So at the point in time you need to do something, only grab it then. Don't preload things that you might not have to use. And again, how to measure the performance of all this. There's basic metrics you can hook up. And we've used products like New Relic and AppDynamics to get live measures on this stuff. So average response, total response, average size, and the number of requests you make. And we monitor this pretty heavily to make sure we're not abusing anybody's device and bandwidth, just to thin down, as we said in the previous slide, what you absolutely need to do. But these are things you can measure. You can do it yourself by logging from the API or logging from the app and just sending to a back end. Spotify mentioned it earlier on, how they log an awful lot of things. I'd like to think they do it in an efficient way that sends in pulses every so often so they're not flooding your bandwidth. But it can be done. You can use outside products. You can build your own. It's not difficult. But then you expand that out by all the different contexts we talked about earlier on. So you've got things like different network speeds, network types, locations, environments, and things that vary the different speeds that you might get to an API. So the response time is partly not in your control, in that it might be slower on a 2G network than a 3 one. And we've looked at ways to serve even thinner responses to 2G networks by detecting the network the device is sitting on at the time and presenting that to the API cache layer, just to make sure we're only sending the data that's going to work on that device, so the app doesn't bottleneck at the front end and people see a lag on it. So it's a difficult thing to work with, but we try hard to do it. But that leads us on to how you affect the front end, because if your API is slow, then people actually see that in terms of a slow app in front of them. It might be a slow scroll, it might be a slow transition between screens, and effectively what users are seeing is lag because of things you've introduced to the app. It might be, as I say, hitting a button to see results, which is our core product. You search for flights and you expect to get them quickly. It might be lag during scrolling because we're providing more data to that screen at the time. It might not all come at one go. Or while rendering screen transitions, if you've got an app that's quite well designed and has animations in it, you've got to be really careful about how you do that. Not to over-design it. You might be on a fairly low-end Android phone in half the world that just can't cope with that level of transition at the CPU level. So you have to be really careful and measure these things. So we had a go at this. We started with the first screen of our app. Now, this loads in roughly 2 seconds or less. The benchmark of the industry is your home screen is bearable to users if it takes less than 2 seconds to load. So keep that in mind as well. By pressing the search button, once you know where you want to go, You're then taken to what we call our day view, which is where we explain prices of flights on a particular date to a particular place. So the user knows what they want. They expect to see results quickly, but of course we get results from airlines, and they don't all send them at the same time. So eventually they come. The previous screen took 1 second to load, but ultimately, to be complete, it took 20 seconds, sometimes longer, to deliver the results the user wanted. Now, we've played around with this, and sometimes we load all the results when they're available. Sometimes we load them as they come, so the user actually sees some progress, and we do a progress bar on the screen to show it's still doing something. Now, users are split. Some of them want to see the results as soon as they're available, but what happens is you might start with a price that isn't the cheapest one, and we have to shuffle the screen because it goes cheapest first in terms of the order we present. We shuffle that live in front of people, so they might be scrolling, and suddenly new prices appear in front of them, which is quite a jarring thing. So we do try and test that a lot to make sure we're not upsetting users by interrupting the scroll or making it look jarring, or waiting 30 seconds on a blank screen to deliver all the prices. And it's something we have to be really careful about. And even then, those prices are the last known price the airline had. What we then do is get the absolute live price you're going to get to make sure it's the truthful one. When you press book, that's hopefully what you're going to go through at the airline and buy. But again, that's a slow process because we have to wait for the airline to respond. So bearing in mind our product model and how we do these things, we're not always in control of how the user experience works. So we have to do what we can to minimize the delay and try to explain to users there's something happening. And we do okay with it by and large, hence the number of downloads and users we have. But it's been a difficult process over the years to get this right and really nail it. Something else we have worked on pretty hard in the last year or so is the latency of the front end. So when people actually do something or watch something, that it's actually bearable and doesn't upset them too much, that they get rid of the app from the device. Now, this is something we use on Android called GFX Info, which is a system shell command. And you can automate this and dump the data. It's actually a very good tool I'd recommend if you're an Android developer. Don't know of an iOS equivalent, if I'm honest. We used this as a bit of a test run to make sure it works. Now, the ideal scenario for an Android app in terms of how quickly it draws the screen, so as you move from screen to screen, or if you have elements that appear, or animations that are transitional, the ideal is 60 frames per second. That's recommended by Google. That's the sort of bearable human eyeball animation frames per second speed. They're kind of moving now on Android M that 120 frames per second is better, and they actually notice people are going to prefer that, but not every device can manage that. So 60 frames per second is recommended. Now, what that boils down to is that every frame drawn on the screen must be 16 milliseconds or less for that 60 frames per second to hold up. And that's just simple maths. That it's about 960 milliseconds, to hit 60 frames per second. So what you see there, the red line drawn across the graph, is where we've drawn something on the Android screen, and it's gone over that threshold, and sometimes way over the threshold. We're treble it almost in some cases. So clearly we're upsetting the user. It might drop frames, so it looks blocky, it jerks as you scroll or as you move from one screen to another, or a button press doesn't quite animate the way you expected it, and it looks bad. So we took this data and we try and work very hard to remove things that make a screen load slowly or an animation load slowly, and measure the hell out of it before we put it in front of users. Because Spotify's here today, we did a bit of an exercise to see what their app does. They are well under the threshold the entire time, so they actually do a really good job with their Android app, and in terms of how it moves between screens, how search results appear, and things like that. You can see they do it very well. They follow the industry standard. Just for the sake of proper comparison, we then took one of our rivals, who I'm not going to name, and their app, which is almost exactly the same business model as us, but in different markets, has a terrible experience. It's much worse than ours in terms of the sort of raw output as the app is used. And again, so that gives us a little bit of comfort that maybe it's not the app that's the problem. Maybe it's just how we run our product, and users bear it because they know flight prices aren't quick things to get, which takes us out of the dark side back to the product again, and how you measure everything. It's really about choosing the right measures and stitching them together, and choosing the right metrics to measure your overall product performance. The technicalities there were a brief sideshow for me in terms of how we explain all this. They're good, and they're things you should do as you develop, but it's not necessarily relevant Choosing the right numbers is something people like Facebook had to face up to. So they used to measure monthly active users as their industry benchmark. They used to announce this to shareholders and things like that. But it was completely meaningless. I mean, nobody uses Facebook once a month. It's a much more frequent product than that. They moved to daily users a while ago and then had to split out mobile daily users. So you can see how they've transitioned over the years there. The sort of bottom right, mobile daily active users is what they quote to shareholders now because it's the most relevant metric and it's the one their product affects directly because they want people to be in the app every day. And that's, as the mission of the product, that's what they measure. So keep that in mind about how you measure different things, and all the different technicalities join themselves together to measure performance. Good example, somebody using LinkedIn. LinkedIn has different user cycles. Some people use LinkedIn to find a job, which they might do every 4 years. Some people use LinkedIn to snoop on their friends having new jobs, which they might do every few months or few weeks. Some people use LinkedIn now as a news service for business, which might be a daily thing, and they've actually got apps now that cater for that specifically. There's no single metric going to help you measure that, so that they can't get to total sessions or total daily users, because there aren't daily users on Facebook as a unique group. So they actually have 3 or 4 separate measures to make sure their performance is what they expected. And all the things that lie underneath that we've talked about today, whether it's product, technical, or something else, they completely separate them out. What they try and do is get people into a funnel where they might start out as a once every 4 year user looking for a job, but try and move them further down the cycle so they start snooping on friends, or they start reading news or something that makes them a more frequent user, which is the user most likely to pay LinkedIn as a subscriber. So they try and move people through that process. So their measurement is more about the volumes of people in each different basket and how many they can move from place to place. And that's their product performance. And there's all sorts underneath it, as I say. And then you have to think about that conversion and what the conversion actually means. So we live in funnels as a sales app. We sell flights. So we want people to come to the app and buy something on that first visit. Now, that's unlikely because people do research. Flights isn't exactly a swift purchase. You might be more aligned to renting a car, which is a different product we have. Because people tend to know they want a car. When flights are such an expensive purchase, you do tend to do the research first. But again, as Facebook found out, what do you actually measure? Is it conversions per session? In our case, it probably isn't for mobile apps. On desktop, we get higher conversions, so you maybe use that there. But on mobile, conversion per session isn't really that relevant because there's a high level of research. So do we measure conversions per user? And how often do we measure the user? Is it conversions per user per day, or conversions per user per month, or something else? Now, we're trying to work out what the best measure is for us as the products evolve. And the measurements change over time. Again, going back to talks earlier today, you never stand still with these things. A measurement that worked for Facebook 4 years ago is no longer relevant. The same for us. The things we measured even 2 years ago with apps just aren't relevant anymore because the usage patterns constantly change. So your whole funnel of how you get people through and measure the success of it is something that's almost organic, that it develops as the user's behavior does. And you have to be really forward thinking about how you plan metrics. One last thing, I'm going to have a bit of a rant. And this is what generated this talk in the first place. That when I was in the conference last year talking about app quality, all the other vendors that were on the stage with me were obsessed with crash rates. And it's something the industry is obsessed with. And I wish people wouldn't be, because it's a completely false economy at times. If you build an app well enough, it's not going to crash that often. In the industry, that's the average over the last year or so in iOS. And as the system's changed from 7 to 8, the 9 figures have gone up a bit again since this. The crash rates tend to settle on iOS at about 2% generally, and that's acceptable to users. Clearly, you would want it to be a little bit lower than that because you don't want it to crash too often. But people obsess as app developers about getting rid of crashes to any degree. Now, we've got some history at Skyscanner of abusing this, that we tried really hard to get to a 0 crash rate. Now, you think, especially in Android, with all the different devices you have to build for, and all the different combinations that you build against, it's almost impossible that you're going to solve a crash for the one user who uses an 8-year-old tablet in Indonesia. The time you spend on that versus actually spending time making the app better is a completely false thing to do. So again, you try and figure out what the most palatable level of crashes is for you. I suspect for us, getting to 0.1% actually wasted an awful lot of time. And if you looked at one of our apps last year, I think it went 6 months with the words various bug fixes in the App Store as the change for that release, which put people off coming back to it. And because we spent the time trying to get to 0 crashes, and I've really tried hard within Skyscanner to get that mindset changed, that there's a tolerable level of crashes that just happen. Because you live in a system you don't always control 100% of, just let it go. And I think it's a complete trade-off between product quality and actually over-engineering an app to meet very niche things. And I hope that makes sense to you as part of the whole performance metric measurement. So in summary, and I hope that all made sense, going back to the start, only really deliver an app and build it if you can justify it against other ways of meeting users' needs. Going back to the whole mobile moment thing, unless you really want to hit users in that way, it might be better to leverage a website or leverage a site you've already got and follow some of the things Vitaly talked about in terms of making it responsive and adaptive. Make sure you can explain very clearly what it does, or people will never download it in the first place, and there is no performance unless people actually use the thing. Pick your performance measurements very carefully, base them on the product and not on the technicalities of the code. Work your way back from what the app actually does and that people understand what it's going to do before you pick number measurements. And don't worry about edge cases and things like 0 crashes. Spend your time on the majority and the growth of your app, and not the 18,000 Android combinations that might have problems at one end of the day. Just to illustrate the last point, we reckon you could hit 80% of the Android market with 56 devices, I think it was, which we had in stock in the company. And you can automate nowadays as well. You get it 90% with 150. So really sort of zero down on what's important to you and making the product incrementally better. And if you can solve things along the way like crashes and bugs, do so. But be very careful about your time while you do it. I hope all that made sense to you. Thanks for listening. And I think we've got -1 minute for questions if anybody has any. Thank you very much. Do we have time for one question up the back? Okay. Sure.
Okay, I think we can start.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I have a pretty simple question, but I believe the answer would be a complex thing.
Okay.
So, I believe that you have many sources, like you have a website, you have the app, you have the mobile web. How do you compare those three?
So as I say, we use the different things for different purposes. Traditionally, we used to think that the app was a research tool and people came to desktop to actually make a booking, because people prefer to pay on desktop than they do on mobile as a trust thing, and it's easier because people filling out details tend to do it on keyboards. But that's changing over time. So as I said, you have to keep following what the users do, and we found that the users that were on desktop suddenly went to mobile web because their devices changed over time and they use phones more often than they use laptops and computers. So we found that as they migrated to mobile web, they converted less because the experience wasn't as good. So we worked really hard for most of the last year to get the buying conversion for people on mobile web to exactly where it was on desktop or beat it, because that's where the traffic went. On apps, we think differently, that apps should really have a purpose, that it's not a passive thing that you're going to dip into an app just to buy a flight. We should use the app to figure out by previous behavior, location and things, what people might actually want to do. Use the app in the same way people like Instagram do, that it's the best possible experience to scroll through lots of photos. We use the app to try and inspire people to do things because the technology is that little bit better for browsing. We've got a new app release coming up that really hopefully starts to answer some things people wanted from mobile as a way to browse through flights, maybe when they're sitting on the bus or on their way to work, and then have a way to get out of it and book when they get home, or very quickly book by using things like Apple Pay one day, for example, just to do a one-click book, because Apple holds all the information you need. So one day we'll get to things like that, but the app is more about using using the technology of the device to make the experience better. But it'll be driven by the users. We watch what they do and react to it as quickly as we can. If you're going to predict what the users do, you'll probably not do very well.
Okay, and what you are doing to measure the user's reaction? Because you say that that's the base of your further steps. So.
Yeah, so we have, similar to Kevin at Spotify earlier on, we have massive amounts of user data that we collect. For example, I had a look at how filters are used in our mobile app not so long ago. So filters being refining the number of airlines you get, or ruling out a particular airport, or making it direct flights and things like that. In an average month, I think the filters were touched 10 million times, and we store every piece of that data. We have Mixpanel wired up to all our products to watch live what people do, and very occasionally for a laugh, we'll just watch a user and actually follow them all the way through the journey and see what happens, just looking for the things they touch. Everything in the app is labeled as an event, and we dump off the data to places like Mixpanel and to our own internal logging. Just to watch, so people that used filters 10 times in a session, are they more likely to book? People who do something similar to that, maybe they change the sort order, maybe they rule out particular airlines all the time, so they make that like a permanent filter. Do they find their way through to a booking quicker, or do they find they book more often? We log tons of that stuff on every single platform, and measure where we can how people jump between platforms. So people that start on a mobile app, where do they finish? Did they actually come back, and things like that. So mountains of data, and we basically sit watching it all day.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. One more.
Thank you. If you care so much about the quality of the app, to fix the bug during half year to drop to 0%, how about the security of the app? Do you care about the reverse engineering? Do you perform it to be sure that the app is secure? And how much of the time do you spend during such kind of tasks?
Sure. So I couldn't cover every technicality because it wasn't really the point of the presentation, but we do things like security and penetration tests before every major release. So when we moved to having login and registration on the app, we did a 1-week security test with a company that works with banks, for example, just to make sure nothing was being misused or stored in the wrong place or not encrypted properly. And that's something we spend a lot of time on. It's become part of our cycle. Again, I couldn't find the time to get it into the slide, but it's always part of the development we do. In terms of security and reverse engineering, there's so far you can go with Android, for example, that people will always find a way to break something, but we do whatever is possible to prevent it. And we actively look for people that clone our app. So I think in the last year, we've had 10 companies pretend to be Skyscanner, or 10 companies sort of tap into our data that they shouldn't have done. And we've worked really, really hard on the back end to stop bots getting into things, because they've put an automation app in place that reads our data and reuses it. So we've got a security team that works on that pretty much full time. As I say, nothing's ever perfect, but we do what we can just as part of the routine development cycle to get rid of that. We don't treat it as the same as things like crashes and bugs. It's more important than that. So we've just baked it into what we do.
Thank you very much. I have a question. Do you have a rating dialog? And if yes, how do you use it? Because it's really some interesting thing, and we should be very careful with it, and some user may be distracted with it.
So yeah, we do. We thought early on that was quite annoying if we do it too often, so we built an algorithm in how often you're met with that. Our app, because people don't book flights too often, isn't used every day. So we try and do it in such a way. I think we hit the second session if they actually made a search, so we don't annoy you if you only came to the home screen. then the 5th session if you've done a search. So the algorithm's changed over time, but we really try hard not to make it annoying and hide it for as long as you want. So there's always an option to get rid of it completely if you just don't want to be bothered again. We'd like people to rate the app, and they do tend to do it through the app stores, but we have tried that, and but it's to probably the less annoying end of the scale. We certainly don't do it every session because people wouldn't come back.
Speech.
Cool.
Thank you guys for attendance.
Thank you very much.